All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here today for this event with Navyug Gill. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tarana Baines. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Patrick Heller, the director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, as well as our wonderful staff at the center, Pavan Pandey and Natalia Kharkovskaya, for their support. I would also like to thank the tech team here at the Watson for making all of this possible. And now, without further delay, it is a great pleasure to be welcoming Navyug Gill back to Brown today. Navyug Gill is an associate professor of history at William Paterson University. His scholarship examines agrarian change, caste, and labor politics in Panjab, while also addressing how one might go about studying global capitalism amid conditions of colonialism. Most recently, he's the author of the prize-winning book, Labors of Division. There are several copies lying around, and you can obviously see the cover right here. It's the full title reads Labors of Division, Global Capitalism and the Emergence of the Peasant in Colonial Panjab, and it was published by Stanford University Press in 2024. Labors of Division brings together a consideration of sources as diverse as British land settlement reports, the poetry of Bulleh Shah, and Karl Kautsky's The Agrarian Question. The book combines methods of economic, cultural, and intellectual history to center Punjab, a place and province that has perhaps not yet commanded the attention it ought to in the historiography of the colonial transition in 19th century South Asia. Labors of Division is essential reading for scholars of South Asia. It is also essential reading for scholars of other times and places who might be grappling with the methods at their disposal to relate the local and the global, to make sense of simultaneous divergence as well as convergence. In particular, I'd like to recommend Chapter 5, Producing a Theory of Inadequacy, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and the Political Economy of Comparison. In addition to this new book, Professor Gill has authored numerous articles. This includes an article titled Accumulation by Attachment, Colonial Benevolence and the Rule of Capital in 19th Century Punjab, which appeared in Past and Present, one of the leading journals in the field of history. He has addressed the histories of Punjabi Dalits in another article titled Limits of Conversion, Caste, Labor, and the Question of Emancipation in Colonial Punjab, which appeared in the Journal of Asian Studies. His writing in both English and Punjabi has also appeared in several public-facing venues. He has written at length and with great eloquence about the recent farmers' protests in India. I'd especially like to note a piece titled Gramsci at the Delhi Border, Indian Farmers and the Revolution Against Inevitability. Today, Professor Gill's talk is titled The Global Peasant, Accumulation and Difference in Colonial Punjab. After Professor Gill has finished with his talk, we should have plenty of time for discussion and a Q&A, and we can certainly continue the conversation afterwards at the reception with lots of food. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gill.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, wonderful. So thank you all for being here on this Friday afternoon. It's my good fortune to be again in Providence and to see a few old and new friends and interlocutors. I want to first express my appreciation for those who made this event possible. So thanks foremost to Tirana for not only the warm introduction and invitation, but for bridging the divides between regions, periods, and languages in her own work, and the so-called split between junior and senior scholars. I also appreciate Pavan and Natalia and the folks at the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia. They did a wonderful job on everything from outreach to logistics and hospitality. I had a really great lunch with several grad students. Whoever said the Northeast was standoffish. Overall, I'm glad there are spaces at Brown to have critical, wide-ranging conversations and places that refuse to submit to blackmail. We should not take this for granted. Before we go any further, I also want to mark the fact that we have all witnessed a genocide in Gaza, one fully funded by our tax dollars. No historical analysis of imperialism or capitalism or decolonization can be divorced from atrocities committed in our midst. I confess that in nearly every conversation I've had over the past 2 years, it usually begins by commiserating on how difficult it is to proceed with regular life, much less celebrate a book, in these terrible times. On top of that, we must grapple with the daily outrages happening in the faltering, flailing empire we find ourselves in. I can only encourage everyone to confront this darkness, to reject cynicism, and to insist on alternative ways of ensuring our collective well-being. So my plan today is to try to do three things. First, I'm going to lay out the main themes and questions of the book. Second, I will briefly explain the different chapters as well as some of the archival materials I worked through. And then I will conclude by gesturing to a few of the wider implications of the argument. So let me begin, however, by saying a little bit about what led me to this project. At one level, perhaps with any book, there's a personal dimension. As a child, I grew up in a Panjabi immigrant family in Toronto and would often visit my paternal village called Safuwala in the Moga district of East Punjab. Amid visiting relatives and sites, I was exposed to the peculiar tension between hearing claims of being a peasant, being a kisan, a jat, a kheti badi parvar, with the reality that much of the work of cultivation was being done with and by landless laborers. These were Mazhabis, Chamars, Bauriye, as well as seasonal migrants from UP and Bihar. So from an early age, not only was I uneasy with the intertwining of status and power, but I became aware of the deeper problem with the division of labor itself. On another level, my graduate training was steeped in social and cultural history alongside the history of ideas. The major themes revolved around resisting colonialism and critiquing Marxism within an implicitly all-India framework. However, I found myself not encountering classic resistance in the archive, nor that many dogmatic Marxists in the recent literature. On top of that, the given all-India framework simply did not work for Punjab. And I suspect it doesn't work for places like Tamil Nadu or Kashmir or Manipur or maybe even Bengal. This is probably where I started to question the questions I inherited. Finally, I must say that I am a product of the debates between Marxism and post-colonial theory, and have realized that there need not be a hard opposition between the two. Indeed, I presented certain versions of chapters of this book at various conferences across the world. So there were the global capitalism folks, there was the caste and race people, the labor history wale, the Panjab and sex studies crowd, and the post-colonial and subaltern types. Amid polite engagement, it seemed everyone was a little displeased. There were too many numbers. There was too much poetry. There were too many colonizers, too much Marx, and not enough of everyone else. Over time, I learned to embrace these critiques and to try to hold together a series of competing contradictions as I wrote and rewrote. Now, let me turn to the book itself. It begins with Baba Farid Ji, a 10th century Peer whose verses are codified in the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib. He says, Frida lodan dak bijoriya, kikkar bije jat, handya un katainda, paidan lodan pat. Farid, the cultivator, wishes for grapes, yet plants acacia trees. He is spinning wool, yet wishes to wear silk. To my mind, Farid is speaking to all of us across the centuries about the space between actions and aspirations, and how easily we get lost in the delusions that come from our own arrogance. The apparent simplicity of cultivation might not be so simple after all. With that in mind, this book investigates the historical emergence of the peasant and its implications for a new form of hierarchy in colonial Punjab. British officials regarded the region as the quintessential agrarian province inhabited by a uniquely diligent, prosperous, and martial race of cultivators. They understood the peasant to be, quote, the predominant unit of society, insisting that the most important consideration of all was to implement policies of agrarian improvement and upliftment. This discourse of what I term colonial benevolence was underpinned by an ostensibly moderate revenue demand and protective legislation, coupled with the massive expansion of canal irrigation and extensive recruitment into the colonial military. We show a map to give some indication of where we are. In the bottom right, you see colonial South Asia, and in the top left is the region of Panjab and the different rivers that cross the region from which it derives its name. Such a claim of benevolence can be found in other contexts too, where select forms of patronage and infrastructure are hauled out as signs of progress, regardless of their authoritarian conceptualization, implementation, and deleterious long-term impacts. You can think Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. At its center is the enduring notion that this peasantry experienced nearly a century of unparalleled prosperity. Rather than the immiserations, displacements, and insurgencies that mark other regions of British India, Punjab is seen in much of the popular and even scholarly literature as a bastion of loyalty enjoying an unrivaled period of stability and growth. Yet the narrative of a benevolent colonialism championing a stalwart peasantry is belied when examined through the prism of how caste, labor, and capital transformed the equation of rural power. The claim that peasants remained unscathed, if not strengthened, takes for granted both the idea of the peasant and the nature of agricultural production, as well as the intent and operations of the colonial state. At a deeper level, it normalizes particular class and caste hierarchies by presupposing a continuity of relations from the pre-colonial through to the colonial and post-colonial periods. One indication of this process is the dominant interpretation of land ownership in contemporary East Punjab. According to the 2011 census, over 30% of the population are Dalits, of mainly the Chamar and Mazbi castes, the highest proportion in all of India. Despite mostly engaging in cultivation, they own less than 3% of the total cultivated area. Instead, the bulk of land is held by members of the Jat caste, who account for a third of the population. A similar situation exists in the rest of pre-1947 Punjab, in Haryana and Himachal Pradesh in India, and to an extent in West Punjab in Pakistan. Such disparities are usually explained through the ahistorical equating of identity with occupation, that Jats are peasants and Chamars and Mazbis are simply tanners and sweepers. The post-colonial distribution of power in the countryside is thus reinforced by colonial assumptions about the inherent and timeless quality of rural Punjabis. I challenge the givenness of this agrarian order and the denial of its modern transformation by asking three questions. How did colonial racial, fiscal, and legal policies align the category peasant with hereditary caste identity? What kinds of contestations over collective status, access to credit, and land ownership did this generate among different groups of Punjabis? And what did this mean for the ways global capitalist processes became implicated in local forms of knowledge and power? The book uncovers the tangled politics of how and why colonial officials and ascendant Punjabis together disrupted existing conceptions of identity and activity to generate a new form of hierarchy masked as traditional. The result was the creation of a modern group of hereditary caste-based landowning peasants alongside other groups engaged in cultivation yet relegated to the status of landless laborers. Now, writing a history of the division of labor opens up possibilities for rethinking the conventions of at least three avenues of historical research. The first is that the book questions the very category peasant. Perhaps the most durable figure in modern historiography, peasants have long been a font for a vast assortment of arguments in every discipline in the humanities and social sciences. Dedicated publications such as the Journal of Peasant Studies rose to prominence in the 1970s due to the increasing importance of their object of inquiry. Indeed, it was armies of largely peasant soldiers that toppled governments and empires in China, Cuba, and Vietnam, as well as sparked insurgencies in places like Naxalbari and Telangana. More recently, as Tarana mentioned, in 2020, the peasant dramatically reappeared in the Indian public imagination with a massive protest against a set of neoliberal farm laws, leading to an outpouring of new activism and writing. Still, underlying much of this literature is the notion that the peasant simply existed everywhere. A general, if not generic figure, traced backward from modernity to the recesses of primordial times. Yet these two claims, ubiquity and antiquity, ought to provoke a pause. The obviousness of the peasant is precisely what demands re-examination in terms of what this category meant in different historical contexts, which groups came to occupy it, and how that shaped not only rural political economy, but what we think we know about the past. The taken for granted status of the peasant is thus itself an element in its historical emergence. This book also calls into question the centrality of the colonizer-colonized divide for histories of the colonial world. Such a stark, totalizing binary was in fact generated by the racial logic accompanying European conquest from the 16th century onward that regarded societies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as inherently inferior. While anti-colonial movements inverted this logic as part of their struggle to resist and expel foreign domination, Generations drew on this inheritance to contest the justifications of colonialism by demonstrating the opposite, that colonized peoples were rational, dynamic, civilized, and worthy of freedom. Indeed, post-colonial critique can be seen as an attempt to challenge the obvious as well as insidious arguments, values, and narratives that emerged through the prolonged colonial encounter. Yet, as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire trenchantly remind us, there have always been doubts about the presumed unity and coherence of those deemed colonized. Not only did certain elite local actors ally with European powers, but others took advantage of the tumult of colonial rule, while internal fissures over class, caste, religion, ethnicity, gender, and language were fitfully subsumed, though never silenced, as part of most mainstream anti-colonial nationalisms. This book confronts the chimera of the colonized by foregrounding the competition and contradictions that developed within Panjabi society during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is therefore not another account of colonial subjects versus foreign colonizers, a repeated instance of heroic peasants fighting the British Empire. Instead, I explore how colonialism generated a sustained, multifaceted, and unpredictable societal conflict from which certain groups emerged atop a new hierarchy to the exclusion and exploitation of others. Racial unity might be every bit as hollow as racial inferiority. Lastly, this book offers an alternative genealogy of global capital. If the transformative quality of the bourgeois mode of production is indisputable, the debates over its provenance, essential features, and trajectory have been equally inconclusive. Over a century of political and scholarly writings have, in various ways, explored what actually constituted capitalism proper, how and where it began, and what it then meant for people in different parts of the world. Much of this revolved around competing interpretations of the oeuvre of Karl Marx alongside the supposedly exemplary experience of Western Europe. At the same time, it is not insignificant that the entire literature on modes of production and peasant agency, encompassing people like Ashok Rudra, Utsa Patnaik, and Andre Gundu Frank, among many others, began with a dispute over the status of the peasant during the so-called Green Revolution in Punjab. Rather than attempt to clinch this debate or dismiss it out of hand, I take inspiration from the diversity of perspectives and embrace the contingency it suggests as inherent to all forms of radical change. This requires drawing on Marx differently, not as an authoritative means to adjudicate the truth of capitalism, but as a historical figure offering profound and penetrating, yet inescapably elliptical insights into the world he was able to witness. As Antonio Gramsci remarked, Marx foresaw the foreseeable, and not everything everywhere and for all times. The burden of expectations, of capital to behave in universal ways, and of Marx to provide universalist answers, is called into question by attending to the specificity of the transformation of colonial Panjabi society. This book traces how the domains of economy and culture were in fact co-constituted and intertwined to generate a new, unusual, and variable form of capitalist accumulation. Its point of departure is to engage in the temptation of comparison without smuggling in a modern version of the scale of civilizations. Far from a simple criticism, I try to think with, as well as across and through Marx to make sense of a distinctive global context. Perhaps a final contribution of the book lies in its scope as well as approach towards sources. At first glance, much of what I rely on will appear familiar to historians of colonialism and agriculture. So there are settlement reports, government circulars, famine commissions, census data, and legislative acts. I also make use of less common materials, such as 19th century dictionaries, statistical surveys, Christian missionary texts, local newspapers, and Panjabi proverbs. The old adage about interpretation, that two scholars can reach different conclusions from the same piece of evidence, should be conspicuous. My aim has been to critically engage this conventional archive by contrasting it with other kinds of sources, as well as posing different kinds of questions. On the one hand, in the course of research, I have uncovered certain untapped materials, from vernacular petitions for changing status, to a contract between a landholder and laborer, to intimate details about family consumption patterns. On the other hand, I draw on Sekh and Pagti sacred verses, as well as insights from a range of individuals such as Bhimrao Ambedkar, Manguram, Pranam Singh Ahluwalia, Muhammad Hayat Khan, and Kapoor Singh. Near the end of the book, I analyze the writings of Marx along with Adam Smith, Vladimir Lenin, and Karl Kautsky as theory rather than history. A non-Europeanist, engaging with ostensibly European thinkers, is a deliberate gesture of refusing the boundaries of both discipline and geography, especially when those ideas have so profoundly shaped regions such as South Asia. Indeed, the concepts of Marx, Smith, and Lenin in particular have an import beyond mere accuracy. They circulate the globe through the very grammar of political economy. In this way, I confront the fundamental question of access. Who reads whom and writes about what? In order to defy a hierarchy of knowledge that masquerades as neutral expertise. Monopoly has no place in historical inquiry. This book is therefore an attempt to critically read across diverse genres to reinterpret modern Panjabi society in conversation with global history. The tension between what constitutes the particular and the general remains abundantly indivisible. Now, let me give you a sense of what's going on in the different chapters and share some of the images and some of the materials I worked with. So in chapter 1, I excavate the logic of colonial benevolence through the politics of revenue, knowledge, and culture to offer an alternative history of capitalism. Here I analyze qualitative and quantitative data from various settlement reports alongside the standard account of accumulation in Europe. British officials used the idioms of caste, tribe, and religion to identify certain groups as peasants, giving them exclusive ownership of parcels of land, along with the responsibility to pay taxes in cash to the state. This is the opposite of what Marx describes in Capital Volume 1, where tremendous violence was used to dispossess and displace English peasants from the countryside into cities as a precondition to industrialization. In Punjab, however, peasants were entrenched rather than separated from their villages, inaugurating a distinct form of accumulation. So here are a sample of the different settlement reports I used, and what's striking is officials evaluate, they have sections where they evaluate soil qualities, they evaluate the different crops grown, they evaluate the different irrigation techniques, but also they evaluate human beings. And they mark certain groups as lazy and violent, and certain groups as thrifty and industrious. And they use those calculations to factor in to revenue responsibilities. And these are groups that now are given the duality of ownership and revenue payment requirements. And I put this alongside Marx's narrative of primitive accumulation, which has been built upon by people like Rosa Luxemburg and David Harvey and many others, which is premised on the dispossession and dislocation of people from the countryside and their movement into the cities. And usually that difference is seen as a sign of the lack of capitalism and the persistence of feudalism in places like South Asia. So what I argue in this chapter is actually something different is going on. It's not a lack of capitalism, it's a different form based on attaching people to parcels of land in the countryside in a new way. Chapter 2 explores the discrepancy between pre-colonial understandings of cultivation amid attempts by the colonial state to define and order rural Punjab. Put differently, I trace how the question, who is a peasant, was both asked and came to be answered for the first time. This places census forms, dictionaries, and grammars in conversation with proverbs, legislative acts, and rare local petitions. In particular, by intertwining identity with occupation, the pivotal Punjab Alienation of Land Act of 1901 produced a definition of an agriculturalist based on a mixture of originary descent, caste membership, and a verifiable claim to landholding in order to restrict access to the land market. In this way, Punjab's political economy was invested with a new legally enforced caste-based hierarchy. So here I use pre-colonial proverbs gathered by colonial officials in the early 19th century. And what's striking here is that there's a difference between the vernacular terms and their translations into English. So the vernacular terms would be things like kisan and kirsan and kheti karan wala and hali and sometimes jat or arayan. And the equivalent in English is all sorts of things: farmer, peasant, cultivator, certain castes. which shows that there was no single equivalent of the word and the concept of peasant up to the early 19th century. Next, we have census forms. Many scholars have worked on the census. What's notable that in the first census in Punjab in 1855, there are 8 different castes that people could belong to, according to colonial officials. By the 1881 census, there's 8,392. So in a span of about 30 years, there's an incredible increase in differentiation. And it shows the power and the penetration of the colonial state into the countryside. And so here on column 6 and 7, you get the marking of caste on this census form that was used to differentiate who was considered what. And this kind of documentation and penetration and differentiation manifests in something like the Panjab Alienation of Land Act of 1901. And this is a certificate that was produced in the wake of that piece of legislation that was issued to members of so-called agricultural tribes as the basis for conducting land transactions. So you had to be deemed an agriculturalist in order to buy land. So you could see in the first line here, it's a person, son of, another person, caste. And that caste category that was here had to correspond to a list of agricultural tribes. And so this certificate was issued to people. There were 2 copies made. One was issued to individuals and one was kept at the local land registration office. And one had to use this in order to buy land. And without this certificate, they couldn't purchase land. And then next, I have a petition actually by a group that is seeking to change their status. And this was a petition 1911. So in the wake of the Panjab Alienation of Land Act, a group of Mazhabis requested that they be classified as agriculturalists in 2 districts, in Gujranwala and Lialpur, and be known as agricultural tribes. And what's striking here is that Mazhabis are in the caste classification, they are sweepers and they're considered non-agriculturalists. And yet here's a group that is providing evidence and making a claim to be recognized as agriculturalists so that they can own land and participate in the new land market. In chapter 3, I examine how and for whom rural debt developed into a problem, the conflicting ways it was addressed, and what was naturalized and elided in the process. This brings statistical data, government reports, and legal judgments to bear on untapped vernacular memorials and household budgets. A prolonged debate involving British officials and Punjabi elites over legislative intervention transformed the problem from general debt to land transfer to a certain kind of alienation by undisciplined agriculturalists. As indebtedness became defined as a function of the poor management of resources, its remedy was a paternalism based on managing a supposedly habitual profligacy. As a result, I demonstrate how notions of cultural extravagance and irrationality were used to conceal the new volatility structurally built into the agrarian economy. So in this chapter, we have a screaming headline from the New York Times, which blames peasants for their wasteful spending, who then fall prey to unscrupulous moneylenders, which leads to calls for state intervention. What it shows, I think, is, one, we should have stopped reading the New York Times 100 years ago. But also that arguments like this, we could see these arguments in 2008, 2009 with the foreclosure crisis, that blame people for not being able to make the right financial decisions, that people are too stupid to see their own interests, and that they need forms of intervention to protect themselves or to be protected from themselves. And I put arguments like this alongside family budgets produced by the Board of Economic Inquiry. This was a quasi-government research body established in the early 20th century that tracked income and expenses of different groups. And they would follow it over time, 10, 15 years, all sorts of different groups here for cultivators in Lealpur. And what it shows is that these tenant cultivators spend something like 80 to 90% of their incomes just to feed and clothe their members. And yet at the end of the study, after 3, 4, 5, 10 years, nearly all of them are in debt. Everybody is falling into debt, and they're spending almost all their money just to feed and clothe themselves. So there's no entries for extravagant feasts and jewelry and wasteful expenses. They're barely getting by. And in fact, they're falling into debt. And these are the people being observed by this body. You can extrapolate to people that are not part of the study, and they receive the stipend to be a part of the study, which shows how precariousness is now built into everyday life, that volatility is what is normalized. Chapter 4 explores the politics of emancipation through the problem of so-called lower castes freeing themselves from Brahminical Hinduism, but not the constraints of lowliness or casteism in the early 20th century. I draw on a wide range of sources, from early ethnographies, census figures, and medieval poetry to village surveys and a unique rural labor contract. The chapter begins with Ambedkar's aborted 1936 Lahore speech calling on Dalits to leave Hinduism to achieve emancipation. By that time, however, Dalits of mainly the Jamar and Mazbi castes had already converted in large numbers to other faiths, such as Sikhi, Islam, and Christianity, and even created their own called Ad Dharm. From 1881 to 1931, the percentage of Hindu Chamars and Hindu Churas dropped from 68 to 47% and 58 to 24%, respectively. Yet these groups still experienced myriad forms of subordination and exclusion as a result of being exploited as rural menial laborers. This shows how a new caste-based hierarchy developed through the economy as opposed to the religiosity of untouchability operating under colonial capitalism. So here I have verses from Bhagat Kabir, Ravidas, and Namdev, along with Guru Nanak, from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, which capture the revolutionary critique of caste in pre-colonial Punjab. And I include these here not only because they're relevant to showing a different texture for Punjabi society, but I sometimes think that secular historians of political economy don't usually engage with these kinds of sources, right? They leave this to the kind of religious studies folks, but actually this, I think, can tell us a great deal about political economy and labor relations and hierarchy in pre-colonial times. And I bring those verses to bear on a contract between a landholder and a Siri. And this is something I found from the Board of Economic Inquiry, one of the appendices, and it actually captures this contract for a form of attached labor. And if you read the contract, again, what's striking is that the person here, Chagata, is by caste a weaver. And yet they are going to do all of the work of cultivation without being called a peasant, right? They're going to sign a contract to be attached to a peasant or an agriculturalist for a year. And all of their conditions and requirements are stipulated, and they both sort of sign here. And so they have a kind of yearly contract. So this is not a Jajmani relation, as is sort of evident across other parts of North India. It's not a form of bonded labor and slavery that you might find in parts of southern India. This is a very, it's a form of labor attachment that is both distant and intimate. It's very difficult to describe it in kind of stark terms. The cultivator and the Siri would work alongside one another. This is not some zamindar that has 1,000 acres and all the work is done by others. They're working together. They would eat the same food, usually from the landowner's house. They would sit together, they would work together, they would eat together, and yet one would own everything and the other would be a kind of employee. again, it's hard to kind of parse what this dynamic was, but this is a kind of labor attachment that continued into the 20th century. It maybe fell into disuse probably in the 1980s, even in the 90s. It's still present. Even today, there are still here and there this form of labor attachment. If people are interested, the best, I think, articulation of the complexity of this relation is from a revolutionary Sikh poet named Sant Ram Udasi, who was from a Mazbi caste by birth. And he wrote a poem that's called Jat Te Siri Da Hal. And it's actually, the poem is about the cultivator crying on the shoulder of the Siri because of their predicament of uncertainty, and the crop that they've cultivated together is getting purchased for a very low price from the urban money lender, and the kind of despair of that time. And again, something like this you would never hear in other parts of, say, North India or South India. The cultivators are not having this kind of intimate, affective relationship with the people they labor with. And Sant Ram Udasi kind of captures it in this poem. Finally, chapter 5 charts the capricious career of the peasant as an object of global intellectual inquiry in tandem with the proletariat. How did it come to be invested with notions of deficiency and an expectation to change? And what did this mean for its trajectory in South Asia, apparently diverging from Europe? This perception, I argue, was based in part on the foundational claims made by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, where he deploys a series of comparisons, assertions, and extrapolations to assemble a theory of peasant inadequacy. The rural peasantry served as the deprived opposite of urban workers in order to valorize the superiority of manufacturing over agriculture, which became the true measure of wealth. Smith's ideas about the archaic and inferior nature of the peasantry traveled to the colony, where British officials regarded regions like Panjab as backward and its people as innate peasants in need of tutelage and upliftment. Such depictions became embedded in the social and material relations of Panjabi society through the juridical, fiscal, and racial instruments of colonial rule. This is why I argue modernity in Panjab, and perhaps elsewhere, was premised on the birth of the peasant as we now know it. Now, what might all of this mean in a larger context? Within the landscape of colonial Punjab, I try to show how the domains of culture and economy were disrupted and reordered to produce a new set of relations, processes, and hierarchies. Studies of colonialism have usually segregated the two. Writings on knowledge practices, social categories, and popular perceptions remain apart from cropping patterns, debt ratios, and household expenses. Cultural politics are dissonant with the politics of economic life, an intellectually and historically untenable divide. This book proceeds differently, starting with the challenge to the dominant premise of a stalwart and self-evident peasantry enduring and even prospering under a benevolent colonialism. Rather than inverting this theme by insisting on immiseration and underdevelopment, I have attempted to bring the history of the ideological and material conditions involved in making such an assumption to the fore. Certain caste groups became relatively empowered through the designation of agricultural tribes and gained exclusive access to a new land market, while others were made into menial laborers, denied entitlements to ownership and resources. These processes produced the figure of the hereditary landowning peasant and positioned it at the top of a novel yet volatile capitalist agrarian order. The habit of automatically referring to unmarked aggregate groups, Panjabis and Indians, as much as Nigerians, Chinese, and Brazilians, does not make much sense. Together, these varied themes demonstrate the contestations inherent to one of the most naturalized features of society, the division of labor. The lucid serenity of the phrase itself conceals a world of struggles, both grand and quotidian. As this quote from Adam Smith signals, the originary and masculine status of agriculture and its linear progression is fundamental to the political imagination of the West. I have attempted to show that, in fact, there was nothing inevitable about the nature of rural hierarchy in even the most celebrated province of the British Empire. A series of divisions restructured and petrified relations in 19th and early 20th century Punjab. Hereditary peasants with exclusive land rights and overwhelming class power were an explicitly modern product, one that emerged out of the colonial imbrication of primordial identity with practical activity. The selective use of caste, religion, and tribe ensured that this transformation affected Punjabi society unevenly, privileging some groups while discriminating against others, all the while appearing in conformity with so-called native culture and ancient tradition. At the same time, this book has provided an opportunity to revisit understandings of both the expectations and operations of capital in the colonial world. With an awareness that capitalism does not produce uniformity across the globe, differences in the political economy of Punjab cease to be signs of inferiority or remnants of backwardness with a given trajectory towards correction. Agriculture and the relationship between peasants and laborers were neither vestiges of a frozen pre-colonial culture, nor variants of a feudalism marked by stagism, the semi, the quasi, the pseudo. By demonstrating the historical production of these differences, not only is their fixity undone, but so too is the perception that they are mere impediments to a preordained future. Indeed, part of my argument is that the specific emergence of the Punjabi peasant precludes its inclusion within the rubric of a worldwide and transhistorical peasantry. Instead, I've described how an accumulation of attachments provided certain castes with land ownership, while juridical processes aligned identities with occupations, and fiscal policies restricted access to the market, all amid a discourse of paternalism which naturalized the new volatility of the agrarian economy. Marx, too, in this very last quote, points to the specificity of knowledge categories, productive relations, and the commodity form. In Punjab, fields were plowed, crops grown, and grain harvested for hundreds of years without a fixed notion of the peasant. That subject, singular, exclusive, masculine, caste-based, emerged only at the particular juncture of colonial technologies of rule, instigating an internal struggle for primacy among different groups of Punjabis. Perhaps another more diffuse contribution of the book lies in its reinterpretation of the nature of hierarchy through the prism of history. Contemporary Punjab on both sides of the 1947 border is riven with a myriad of divisions as well as entanglements and aspirations shared with many other parts of the world. Struggles over land ownership, caste conflict, and gender roles take place alongside religious polarization and ecological degradation amid competing designs from New Delhi and Islamabad. At the same time, East Punjab in particular has an unmistakably egalitarian public culture drawing on its radical Sikh heritage, along with one of the lowest reported rates of caste-based crimes in comparison with other states in India. Beset by crises, its cultivators are nevertheless far from the brink of disappearance. Debates abound on redefining the future of agriculture while recognizing that following the supposed trajectory of Europe is neither possible nor desirable. All of these issues are further implicated in global circuits of capital, from shaping the commodity prices of wheat, rice, and cotton to turning human beings into commodified migrants for the pitiless economies of the West. The results are hardly distributed evenly. Certain groups find ways to benefit, while others are excluded and exploited. Yet the overriding explanation of these hierarchies, of class, of caste, of nation, is the simple persistence of beliefs and practices over time, at most unfortunate, but by and large inescapable. Through this book, I suggest a more recent and therefore less permanent inheritance. Shorn of the solidity of antiquity, the peasant, along with the splintered logics of colonialism and capitalism from which it emerged, is made to confront the mutability of modernity. By giving this division of labor a history, I have tried to make clear that it was neither timeless nor inevitable, and thus will not last forever. The power of demonstrating historical change is to therefore bring contingency and unpredictability to our understandings of the past in the making of the present, in order to at least create spaces to think through different possibilities for forging emancipatory horizons. Perhaps, as Baba Farid indicated at the very beginning, one must have faith that the ultimate reward for effort lies beyond its discernible outcome. Thank you. Sure.
All right. Many thanks for that. Can everyone hear me on this? Okay. All right. We should have plenty of time now for a Q&A and a conversation. Whether you know a lot about this topic already or this is the first you've heard about it, I hope you'll take this opportunity to ask questions, to learn more about Navyug's work. So who'd like to volunteer first? Yes, Holly. I guess we have mics around. Alvin, there's a question right there.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Holly, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Holly Case. I teach in the history department, modern East Central, Southeastern Europe. And it's some of the similarities with East Central and Southeastern Europe that I'm keen to think about, because as you were speaking, I was thinking that most, if not all, of the phenomena you're describing, I've seen in interwar instances of, let's say, states with respect to the Roma population, or in pre-World War I states with respect to, let's say, Romanians in the Kingdom of Hungary or Slovaks, where there's mass disenfranchisement, there's attempts at creating multiple categories of citizenship. There's indebtedness of the peasantry increasing, sort of digging deeper and deeper. And in the pre-war period, there's an imperial presence, but it's harder to say colonial in the same way. And in the post-war period, these are nation states. And so I'm wondering how, is it possible to separate the colonial from the state activity, or the modernizing state activity, and wherein would lie that distinction, or how would you draw out that distinction?
Should we take a couple or a moment to think?
Okay. Do other people
something good? Yeah.
More questions? Right here. Thank you.
Sorry, this isn't a hostile takeover by East Europeanists. My name is Kate LeBeau. I teach and work on East Central Europe at the University of Oxford. I was really interested in the linguistic analysis, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about alternative languages of conceptualizing the group that we might call the peasantry. For example, in some of my sources, I've been seeing this phrase, sons of the village, which implies, so in particular, sort of thinking, are there solidaristic vocabularies that compete with vocabularies of labor and ownership?
Yeah.
Should we take one more?
We can, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Radhika.
Hi, I'll make it very quick. Thank you so much.
Introduce yourself quickly.
Sorry, I'm Radhika. I'm in the anthropology department, and I work on agrarian plantations in Northeast India. My question is, I was really interested in, especially when you, through your archival work, where you look into household budgets. And I'm wondering, through archival research, but also anecdotally, how does the figure or the category of the peasant itself is constituted by forms of agrarian work that, let's say, connects the household? So, like maintaining the household, and obviously, what is the gendered nature of this constitution of the category of the peasant itself through forms of non-agrarian work but in fact is very much producing sort of the agrarian, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. Should we meet next week and I can think about this and give you proper answers? If not, then you'll have to just accept whatever comments I can think of. But I really appreciate the questions. To Holly's question, I think it's a very important distinction, and there's a lot of writing on it now, and I think people take sort of different partisan positions on what do we think of the difference between the modern state and the colonial state. and what happens when we move away from the kind of conventional histories of colonial powers, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, maybe the Portuguese, and we look at places like the Ottoman Empire, or we look at Central and Eastern Europe, and to an extent even the Mughal Empire. How do we regard those states? And my instinct is to emphasize that I think that those states don't fall into the conventional classification of sort of colonial powers, even though they can be imperialistic and they can be annexing territories and moving populations and deploying all sorts of brutality and modern technologies into the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. I think there is something different about state authority that regards its subjects as fundamentally different and inferior and unfamiliar. I think the strangeness of the colony is, I think, at the forefront of the way this colonial state operates. So the English administrators, have loads of disparaging things to say about the Irish, right? They think they're kind of uncivilized and backward, but there's a familiarity with the Irish. There's something about, we think they're inferior, but we know about that. But when they travel across the ocean to this place, now all bets are off. Now this place is fundamentally hostile and different. The natives are dishonest. You can't trust a word they say. They're violent. They're lazy. We're unsure of how to deal with the flora and the fauna. The weather is strange. The food is different. I mean, everything about it becomes different and hostile. And so the suspicion and the paternalism, I think, takes on a very different tone. And I think that's what informs the desire to intervene in the countryside and learn as much as you can, because that knowledge is vital to ensuring the stability of the regime in a way that I think the Mughal state or Ranjit Singh's kingdom didn't have to do. It could be extractive, would have high taxes, but it wasn't preoccupied with entering the countryside and ordering it in the same way. And so I don't think again, you would know more, that the imperial Russian state that expands to the south and to the west operates on that premise of the hostility and unfamiliarity of these people. I defer to specialists, but that's my sense of that difference, of the rule of colonial difference in the sense. But I want to link it not just to perceptions, but also to a political economy. To Kate's question, I think this is also very fascinating, and it was one of the things I was hoping to find in the archive. It's a bit about what I said, where I was hoping to find a resistance and a kind of straightforward opposition to the imposition of these new revenue rights and revenue demands, and I didn't quite find it. And so, are there ways that people forge ties across these different different classifications? I think what we have is actually all sorts of layers of claims to land and access to the harvest, and it's very stratified and hierarchical. And I think that those who benefit and acquire that duality of ownership rights and revenue responsibilities take their position at the top of society and sort of are intent on maintaining their position. And so I didn't quite see instances of landless laborers and landowners forging a bond to try to overturn this new system. It clearly benefited one side and subordinated the other in a new way. And at most, there were landless groups trying to acquire status and to try to improve their position. But there wasn't a case of clear, let's overturn this and create something new, at least up till the 1920s. I think the politics of nationalism that become more prevalent in Punjab after the Ghadar Party in the 20s and 30s and 40s maybe touch on some of those things, form lines of solidarity, but it wasn't clear in this late 19th, early 20th century period as much as I could see. To Radhika's question, yeah, also another really great question, and I think I get to something close to that in terms of the evolving nature of the census. So one of the dilemmas the colonial state has is to define household, and they're actually trying to figure out what are these people? How do we know what is a so-called nuclear family? How do we know the difference between a girl and a woman? And they go through all sorts of options and start with age, and then they say, well, no, these natives are different than us, so age doesn't quite work. Do they live together? When do they get married? No, that doesn't work. So menstruation. Now let's try to track menstruation and use that as a way to define this mark of difference. So same with household. Is it everybody that lives under a roof? No, clearly not, because there's so many people that live under a roof. And so they end up with making food from a common hearth. And if everybody cooks from one hearth, that's a family. And the moment another hearth is established, there's a new family. And so this is the kind of level of intricacy, this invasive way of documenting differences that is part of the acquisition of knowledge and the way it maps onto things like ownership. And so in one of the questions of who's an agriculturalist and who's a member of an agricultural tribe, it's taken for granted that it's a man. The peasant is a man, and women's contribution is ancillary. They could be menial laborers, they could help weeding, they could help pick the cotton, they could help do other side tasks, but they're never considered part of, they couldn't be landowners. They could belong to landowning families, but they're a priori sort of excluded from the possibility of being seen as peasants, because masculinity is kind of inherent in that very definition. So that's a kind of way that women writ large are disenfranchised completely. But again, I bring it back to the hierarchies within the category woman. That if you belong to a landowning family, your experience is very different from being part of a landless laborer family. Landless laborer women would engage in aspects of cultivation and still not be seen as potential owners. So they're very much intertwined. Sorry for rambling.
Asama, I can find you on mic. Well, there's a recording, so for the sake of the recording, for the sake of posterity.
Thank you. Osama Siddiqui, I'm a historian at Providence College. Thank you so much, Navyug, for this really wonderful presentation. And the book is wonderful as well. It really just rich theoretically and empirically, and just a very transformative contribution. I want to ask you about how you situate yourself in relation to the scholarship on Mughal agrarian life, and particularly scholars who might have argued that some of the processes of primitive accumulation that you're describing, in a sense, start in the 18th century. And there's this like intensification of extraction. And so that's sort of one piece of the question. And the other piece is related to that is the category of custom. I'm wondering if you can say something about that. In the North Indian case, as you know, often when agriculturalists are sort of pressing land rights, they'll often make a recourse to, some claim that they had, say, like, oh, I had this in like Aurangzeb's reign, or this has been in my family for this long. And the terms in which the peasant is available to British officials who are making these claims are often terms inherited from a kind of Indo-Persianate Mughal system. And so I'm wondering how you make sense of that and how that relates to your story. But thanks so much.
Should we gather a few more? All right, go ahead.
I'm Siddharth, a visitor at Saxena Center this semester. There was one petition that you showed by Mazhabi Sikhs to change to agricultural tribes. What were the implications for Jati? Was it an attempt to change their Jati classification in a sense? I was curious about that. And the other one is, how do you see your work kind of linked to the current, or at least the farmer mobilization that happened in 2020, and if you look at much of the mobilization, it came from the north, right, from Panjab, Western UP, parts of Haryana, but didn't really kind of come from the south as much. Maybe some sporadic Kannadiga or Tamil farmers or Andhra farmers, but it really wasn't that didn't drive much of the farmers' protests. It was predominantly in the north. How do you link some of your historical work to these sorts of differences in how farmers mobilized during the protests?
Big question, should I?
Yeah, go for it.
So thank you both. Again, we need another seminar or a workshop or something to think through these really rich questions. So for Osama, I think those two questions, they're in a way intertwined, but it's actually a very long debate, right? And I sometimes joke about this is like the at kutte di ladai between the medievalists and the modernists, right? That a modernist makes an assertion about something different in the 19th or 20th century period, and there's a medievalist reminding them that no, in the 14th century there was, or in the 8th century there was this, and everything has a longer history to it, and it's absolutely true, and it's valuable. But I do think that so the Mughal Empire at the time is in some places taking cash revenue, and there's individual ownership rights in certain parts. I mean, so it's hard to even speak of the Mughal Empire, but even in its kind of fragmented, decentralized way in the 18th century, some of those elements are present. But I think that it goes back to the alienness of the regime. So it's a question of, I think, alienness, but also capacity. And I think that the Mughal regime, and then in a place like Punjab, the different Afghan rulers, and then Ranjit Singh's kingdom, they don't have the capacity nor the interest to enter the countryside and document and surveil in minute detail all of the economic activity taking place. They're familiar with it. There's a lot of deferral. There's tax farming. There's other mechanisms that are used to extract revenue. A key divide is something like in-kind versus cash payments. And I think that flexibility is a stark difference. That if it's an in-kind payment, if there's a drought, if there's pests, if there's a flood, there will be less harvest, and so the state will get less, right? Because that's the in-kind, that's the flexibility built into in-kind. When it becomes cash, and this is the colonial state saying, we cannot trust and send people out at every harvest because it's dangerous and it's too vast, and people hide their crop, like cultivators across the world for 1,000 years. They'll hide their harvest. So instead, let's calculate how much each parcel of land is supposed to produce. And so that's the revenue settlements, where they're using studies of soil and water and the crops grown to mathematically calculate the potential produce of this parcel cultivated by this group of people. And we can use that to sit in an office and then determine what the tax rate should be, and then demand it in cash. A drought, a flood, be damned. That's what we want. And so that is very different. Ranjit Singh doesn't do this, and the Mughals, at least in Punjab, don't do this. So even though there are elements of these kinds of say institutions or these mechanisms, the nature of the colonial state means they take on a different valence, and they're combined with things like caste and religion and tribe entering into legislation. Right? Like the Panjab Alienation of Land Act. No Mughal state is adjudicating who can buy and sell in that way. So to my reading, there is a marked difference between that. And it also goes to the question of custom, because in the first land settlement, revenue settlements, colonial officials go out and record who has what claim. And they use those, they track those things. And what they're very keen about is people that have hereditary claims. They're very insistent to annul those and turn those people into pensioners. And you can see the operation of the state, right? That if somebody has the revenue of 5 villages, there's a kind of devolution of sovereignty in a way, right? That this family has the revenue of 5 villages. They were rewarded from Akbar or someone, and they've been having it for generations. The colonial state can't tolerate this. So instead, they'll say, let's calculate what your family might have earned. We'll give you a cash pension, and those 5 villages' revenue go to the state. is we're not going to allocate revenue anymore. You're going to get paid in cash, and we're going to take all the land revenue. So they actually shift people over from jagirs. This is the kind of canceling of jagirs and making them pensioners. And now those people's loyalty is tied to the state. And if they ever stray, the pension is revoked. So we could go on, but it is a fascinating kind of conceptual, discussion of these different forms. To Siddharth's question, yes, thank you for that. The question of these Mazbis is fascinating because, one of the, again, back to pensions, one of the rewards for military service after 25 years was parcels of land in the new canal colonies. And so the military, as it's recruiting different groups of people into the British Indian Army, after 25 years of service, an ex-soldier would be given 1 or 2 or 3 squares of land. The problem comes where the military wing is recruiting different people, Jats and Rajputs and Sikhs and others, but also Mazbis. And then they do their service, and then they're given these lands. But in the civil administration, Mazbis are not agriculturalists. And so they're not supposed to be cultivated. They're tanners. Mazbis are the ones that clean euphemistically night soil, which is human shit. And that's all they're good for in their calculation. And so these ex-soldiers say, no, we served our 25 years. We are owed land, and we actually do the work of cultivation. And so it was a kind of friction between their officers that were supporting their petition and the civil administration that had this sense of agriculture and non-agricultural. So the fate of this petition, actually, they're granted. They have to actually make this concession. But they make it in 2 districts, Gujranwala and Lalpur, for just this group, which goes to the absurdity of legislating what a person is. Because in these districts, this biological Mazbi's DNA can be a peasant. In everywhere else, their DNA, hereditary status is landless laborer. It is absolutely absurd, and yet they proceed with it. But it's not, like, all Dalit groups are not contesting it. So this is the kind of unevenness. In terms of the farmers' protest and the mobilization, yeah, absolutely. It was Panjabi farmers at the forefront of it. And it was a remarkable challenge to a set of neoliberal farm laws, but also the kind of imposition from Delhi on dismantling a system of agricultural production that had what is called the so-called Green Revolution. So the regime of minimum support prices and government supports was most prevalent in Punjab and Haryana and Western UP. And so when these were proposed to be dismantled, those would be the areas that people mobilized. The Kisan and Mazdoor unions were most active and organized in those places. It's not unimportant that these were led by Sikh, and the Sikh religion also informed a lot of the actions and activities of people at the protest sites at Tikri and Singhu, things like the institution of langar, people eating and cooking together, and a willingness to confront the state. These are elements that are all part of it. I also think there's a difference with the histories that I work on, 19th, early 20th century, and 1970s and 80s onward, post-Green Revolution mobilization. So the dominance of the farmer, the dominance of the peasant that I speak of, doesn't again mean that they're 1,000-acre owning zamindars that are, enjoying lavish lives. It is a hierarchy amidst the volatility of a new capitalist order under colonial rule. And in the 60s and 70s, the dynamic changes.
I'm going to take a moment now to just quickly ask you to say something about how Punjab becomes a quintessentially agrarian province in the British imagination. Are there alternative ways in which British colonial officials think about Punjab before it takes the form that you study in the 19th century? And I'm thinking about the fact that in the 18th century, before the British are anywhere near Punjab, they think about Punjab potentially as a place where they might find good consumers for British manufacturers such as woolens. That the climate is colder, people in Madras, Bengal, and Bombay don't buy British woolens, but in Punjab and further into the northwest, that might be a place where we can find good consumers. This is just a question about, are there alternative visions that imperial colonial officials have before this particular idea of turning Punjab into this imagined agrarian province takes place. And also, if you zoom out and think about the British Empire in many different places in the 19th century, are there places which begin to look somewhat like Punjab in material terms, but also ideological terms? Obviously, you're familiar with Canadian history. I'm also thinking about Aaron Jakes's book on colonial economism and the British occupation of Egypt. I think he has a chapter titled Punjab on the Nile. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered about all these other different places where some of the same actors are making decisions about what looks like an increasingly global imperial economy, and how many different provinces, colonies, dominions, protectorates might fit into a larger network. But we can also collect some more questions, unless you'd like to take this for now.
Maybe one more.
Okay. All right, Maria, is there a mic in your vicinity?
I'm Ria. I'm a PhD student in history. You make the case that Punjab is distinct in some ways in agrarian social relations. The Jats and Siddhis are not maybe bound in a straightforwardly hierarchical relationship. But it seems to me some of your remarks about caste are kind of provoke similarities in South India and North India. And here I'm thinking about books like The Pariah Problem and Reconsidering Untouchability, which similarly de-link caste from occupation and make the case for an agrarian economic political view of caste rather than one steeped in religion or spirituality. So I wonder if you could comment on, I guess, kind of the inverse of your question, Tirana, like in what ways is Punjab distinct, and in what ways does it make sense to think comparatively with caste in particular in other regions of India?
Yeah, these are such great rich questions. It's just really, I think the questions are going to be better than any little answer I can muster. So I think, Tirana, to your questions, Punjab is, the last, viable independent kingdom that is conquered by the British finally in 1849. Awadh and other places remain, but in terms of a kind of real threat to company rule, and throughout all the colonial officials' writings that I've come across, I mean, they're impressed, fearful, concerned about Punjab. They're wary. They're aware of Ranjit Singh's efforts at consolidating his empire. And for many, in 1809, the treaty signed in Ludhiana, the Treaty of Amritsar, establishes the border on the Satluj River, and many officials that's going to remain the border, and there's no intent to kind of go further. The northwest frontier province used to be UP or the northern provinces, right? Until after they conquered Punjab, and they moved the designation to further west. And I think it was after the Anglo-Sikh War, so-called, in 1845 and then finally 1849, that Punjab is annexed. And it's during those wars that, again, officials that had served that time and witnessed the ferocity of the fighting and the very sort of precarious by chance nature of the company victories. I mean, they could have easily lost. It was extremely contingent. That led to this sense that we have to govern this place differently. And after 1849, 8 years later, there's an uprising across North India. The very same soldiers that were used to subdue Punjab now rise up. So a lot of people in Punjab were not interested in supporting the 1857 revolt, especially when it was seeking to reinstall the Mughal emperor. So the colonial officials in Punjab are determined to govern this region differently. All of them say that the permanent settlement of Bengal was a disaster, that it cannot be repeated here, that we must learn from our mistakes. And so this is where that claim of colonial benevolence sort of begins. And you get that Punjab school of administration where officials are going to go on horseback and be intimate with the population and be flexible and adhere to local customs. And so that's where that generosity. And so then for them, the key kind of feature becomes moderate revenue demands. and the agrarian nature of these people becomes unquestioned, and we're gonna provide recruitment, and we're gonna provide infrastructure, and we're gonna keep them sort of pacified. Also, I think there is a kind of ecological kind of dimension to it, that the land is fertile, it is level, it is well irrigated, especially the central and eastern parts. And so that factors into the calculation of what can be grown here, and how useful it can be. I mean, they're having projections and calculations right from the 1820s onward about what's the projected cotton output of this place, and we can use that. And then later on, during the American Civil War, the U.S. cotton supplies off the global market. And so places like Egypt and Panjab, there's a kind of cotton boom. Prices go high, and a lot of people, shift to growing cotton because the demand is so great. So that all factors into this notion of this place is agrarian. I also just want to add that I think that a lot of times people imbibe this and sort of take it on board and think of it as part of their own identity. So, the Ibbetson's chapter on the races, castes, and tribes of the people, published in 1881 as a chapter in the long census form, that has been published as a standalone book. And you can find it in bookstores today. And people kind of read this in India and elsewhere in a kind of fond way that, look, the colonial official says we're brave. And they say that we're strong and hardy. And the same colonial official is denigrating you and calling you lazy and violent elsewhere. And you just sort of overlook that, right? So it's like we reject colonial denigration, but colonial praise we'll take, right? So it's a kind of extraordinary. So that's part of like agrarian. Agriculture is in our blood. Our culture is agriculture. You hear these things being said, and part of it is post so-called Green Revolution as well. But it shows the persistence of this colonialist way of understanding the world and even oneself sometimes. You see the arguments I have with like family members and kinfolk about some of these things. Other places, yeah, it's great. I was having conversations about Aaron's book and others, friends working on North Africa and elsewhere, Canada. I think that a lot of these British officials are traveling to these places and learning and deploying some of these categories. I do think places like settler colonies like Canada or maybe Australia fare differently in the imagination. But certainly places like Egypt or Jamaica or Punjab, in terms of growing crops, but also having to deal with natives. I think that's the difference, right? What to do with these people and how to placate them and ensure we have stability above all else. I think that's the kind of preoccupation, and that's a kind of thread. If it's not, say, caste in Egypt, it's, if caste becomes an indelible feature of these people, a person by their caste, it could be religion, or it could be tribe. It's some other, function of collective categorization that, never mind the individual and their personality and qualities, you just know their type. And that type set is what allows you to kind of rule over a people and think that this is kind of rational and modern. To your Raya, right? Ria. Your questions, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rupa's book was she's a friend. It's a fantastic book, and I learned a great deal from it. And other scholars that have worked on Tamil Nadu and southern parts of South Asia, I do struggle with trying to figure out what is the import of this argument to other places, and because for me, the seedy relation is not slavery. It's not abject disdain, hostility, and hatred. Historically, and even in the mid 20th and early, late 20th century. And so, how do we talk about hierarchical relations? How do we talk about exclusion and uneven sort of economic returns on common activity, but not put it in those kinds of stark categories? And to me, this goes back to disaggregating the category India. I don't think it works as a kind of overarching framework. I mean, even something simple like zamindar. Again, everybody that learns zamindar hears of the talukdars and the zamindars that own 1,000 acres in UP. In Punjab, we don't even say zamindar. We say jimidar, is the colloquial. And a jimidar is if you have a half an acre, you're a jimidar. And so, and there's no hesitation to self-cultivate. There's no disdain. There's no embarrassment. They're active, energetic cultivators themselves. So, and because they don't have this kind of pollution, and touching the plow is ritually lower. In a sense, Sikhi emancipates people from that notion, at least in central and in eastern Punjab, and it percolates through other kinds of maybe religious traditions. But yet and still, there are landless laborers. And so I guess what I'm trying to think about is this idea of landed and landless is a kind of modern construct. That nobody is landed in the 3rd century because nobody's landless. That notion of one's identity and their activity being imprinted in their DNA, and that we can identify them and make things hereditary through legal instruments like laws and legislation, that is something very new. And it takes place in Punjab in a kind of different way.
All right, Sam, and then Avni.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a PhD student in the history department. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I think what I found most compelling about it was your attempt to problematize the notion of a sort of static peasant to historicize the peasantry. At the same time, I heard you deploy the category of modernity throughout your presentation, presumably throughout the book. And this is something that I struggle with. It seems kind of like a slippery concept to me. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you define modernity, what sort of intellectual genealogy you're sort of linking up with there. And then also, I guess the question I'm really curious about is whether the onset of modernity means something different than the onset of global capitalism.
Right. Should we add some more?
Sure.
All right. Avni, Sam, pass the microphone. Thanks.
Hi. I don't know if this is on. Is it?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear you. And introduce yourself.
Avni, second year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology. Thank you so much for the talk, and the book cover of the version, I guess, that's published in India looks beautiful. It looks different from the one y'all have with you.
It's very different.
Stanford did an okay job.
And my question is on the sort of, you said this towards the very end of your talk in terms of how you're, I don't know if collapse is the right word, but weaving together the notions of culture and economy and not treating them as distinctive. And like the sources that you use obviously are doing a lot of that work. And so I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little more about how you, whether this was a conclusion you sort of arrived at of not seeing these two I guess, concepts, notions, disciplines as distinctive, or if that was a point of departure for you, and if that was how you started thinking about this work, what were the sort of intellectual grounds on which you were thinking about economy and culture as something that are inseparable? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. Okay, great. Now, just repeating myself about the richness of the questions and how wonderful they are, and how I really want more time to talk it, or more time to think about it. But I'll try responding. Sam, thanks for the question. I think, yeah, this is also a large debate, right? In the literature and different schools of thought about capitalism and modernity. I think the way I arrive at an answer is I follow the claims of my interlocutors and my historical subjects. So one of the things that the British are insistent on is the difference of their rule. That their rule is unlike native rulers because it's rational, because it's logical, because it's modern. And they say things like, after we took over in 1849, we're trying to arrive at a rational land settlement, because the previous ruler, in the Ranjit Singh, they say something like his revenue settlement relied on notches on a stick and his tenacious memory. And this is just arbitrary. And the arbitrary nature of pre-colonial rule to their eyes was the justification that they bring something different. And for them, peasants especially need rational rule Because if they know how much they're going to be taxed, then they can improve their plot and increase productivity because the tax rate will stay consistent, and then they can bring more land into cultivation. So the revised revenue settlements happen every 20 years. So once you know your revenue rate, you have 20 years to extract more from that land, make it more productive, and you'll pay the same amount. And in order to get people onto these cash revenue responsibilities, they actually peg the revenue responsibilities quite low. So if the in-kind pre-colonial rate was a third of the harvest, they will take 10%, sometimes 5%, just to get people used to paying cash. This is 0% APR on your credit card, right? It's a kind of similar logic that once because they realize that if we get people to pay 33%, they'll fight this. So the British are, in that sense, the company and later the Crown, our own debate aside, is making the claim that we are modern. And part of our modernity is to bring this new kind of rule. Now, I think that intersects with the debates on capitalism and what does capitalism look like in the subcontinent under colonial rule. From all of the wonderful histories we've read, especially on American slavery, we realize that capitalism is not just the factory floor. The plantation is capitalist. And so now what? When you have coercion and brutality and growing tobacco and cotton and other things functioning as a kind of capitalist enterprise, that makes us rethink it. That opened up so much for other histories as well. So in this time, I'm finding that this is a kind of productive relation. It's capitalist. It's not feudal. What I'm contesting is the notion that this is like persistence of feudalism. Even today, when you encounter people that want to condemn some sort of cultural practice, they say, semi-feudal, feudalism is still present. I'm like, no, we have to condemn some terrible activity, but we need a new vocabulary to talk about it. And it's not just holdovers from ancient times. So I see them as overlapping, but I proceed from the articulations of the administration of the colonial officials because they are the ones that make that first claim. And that's where I say that our capitalism looks different. And it's an accumulation of attachment. And because we don't have a proletariat, we actually, that sequence that from peasant to proletariat, I track to Adam Smith. For us, I think, what do we do when there is no proletariat? Are we just sitting around waiting for one to appear? And that's where I take people like Ande Gunder Frank and the Latin Americanists who again made us rethink development and underdevelopment as coeval rather than sequential. To Avani's point,
we have time.
Okay, good. I know I'm rambling. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great.
Avani, yeah, these are a really wonderful question. It's a wonderful question about economy and culture, and I think what I'm trying to do is, I think I say it here, but it might not have been clear, is that I think just things like caste, right, or things like colonial technologies of rule. So much has been written about how these things. The imagination of colonial officials and how these categories and classifications work to define groups of people, castes of mind. And for me, I found that it's an extremely exciting and valuable literature, but I always felt like it stayed apart from political economy concerns, about ownership, about exploitation, right? So what's the difference between humiliation and exploitation? Right? Exclusion and exploitation. How do we think about that divide? And that's where I'm trying to think about the domains of economy and culture being co-constituted and intertwined. Because our economy is not just straightforward workers and producers and consumers and commodities circulating. Because it happens in a colonial context under a regime that sees these people not as people, but as natives, with all of their deficiencies. And the paternalism of having to rule and civilize these savages. And so that actually informs political economy. So what I try to go through in great lengths is that colonial judgments about people, colonial anxieties about rule, don't just remain in the heads of these administrators. So it's not just their like racist ramblings that they write letters back to. It actually becomes part of law. It becomes part of the way you engage in the land market. And so that's what I'm trying to like hold those two domains together. And finally, I just say that I think that's why our political economy is different. It actually departs from the so-called standard account of Europe, because they don't encounter, in the standard narrative at least, specialists obviously, can show the alternative side, but they don't encounter this hostile, irredeemably different, unfamiliar group of people that they have to go through extra lengths to civilize, knowing that they can never do so. Because if they actually civilize these people, they have no reason to be there. So it's like there's no development in the 19th century, it's improvement. And you can improve somebody because they're deficient, and it can take forever.
All right, Rithima.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm Rithima, a PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies. I work on Islam in South Asia. What I found fascinating about your work is how you look at the categories of the vernacular and the literary in your study of labor land in colonial Punjab. I saw you quote medieval or pre-modern texts, Bhakti Sufi texts. I'm just curious how these texts feature in the period that you are studying colonial Punjab, because someone mentioned the contemporary protests, and Begumpura showed up in the protest space in a very curious, interesting way. So I understand that there is a series of reception that is possible across time. So I'm just curious how these texts feature in the period you're looking at, whether these texts are descriptive of how these people are thinking of themselves, or whether there is some contention in that. So that's my question, the literary in your period that you're studying. Thank you.
Other questions for us? And then Ariel. Might have lost.
Hi, Faraz, history PhD candidate. Thank you for your remarks. They're very, very helpful. So you mentioned at the outset that you're a product of the debates between Marxism and post-colonialism in South Asia. So I wanted to ask you, how do you sort of safeguard your scholarship from, leaving too much at the doorstep of colonialism when you're talking about the emergence of the peasant category in colonial India? Because I know you spend some time in your book in sort of complicating the binary between colonizer and colonized. I ask this because we've seen this sort of recent trend in the Dalit scholarship. The previously more fashionable, more prevalent idea of caste being porous and then sort of crystallizing under colonial conditions is sort of kind of critiqued by the modern Dalit scholarship, who sort of argue that that may not be the case, and even if that is the case, it was emancipatory in many ways.
What was emancipatory?
The sort of the rights that came with this sort of categorization. So yeah, how do you safeguard your scholarship against this?
Ariel, do you want to add your question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ariel. I'm a postdoc here at Brown. My question is really mundane, so apologies for that. But I was really struck with the labor contract that you showed, that the only kind of labor that was actually described in the contract was actually related to cows. And sort of it says that this person might have to sleep with the cows at night. And so not about land, but then still, of course, somehow tied to the land. So I really just wanted to invite you to reflect a bit on why that was the case, to ground us in that sort of material social world a bit more. But thank you so much for this talk.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we have a bit more time. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, really wonderful questions again. I know I'm just repeating myself, but I think the Rithima's question, yes, about the vernacular and the question of literature. I think I invoke Bhakti and sex sources from the 14th and 15th, 16th century, because I think it gives an insight into the world of caste hierarchy, as well as the project of caste emancipation. And so I think one of the things I try to do in the book is to think about, in a basic way, just historicizing hierarchy. And what happens is thinking about, of course, there's long histories of caste oppression. It's not, and I'll come to this in a second, it's not something that just gets invented wholesale in the 19th century. If there was no caste hierarchy earlier, then why would Guru Nanak have to articulate an opposition to caste, right? Why would Buddha have to oppose caste practices? Obviously, there was hierarchical practices of caste, segregation and exclusion. But I think what I try to do is historicize what did emancipation look like in the 15th century? What was the nature of the exclusion? And I say that I think the practices of hierarchy in the 15th century were different from the 19th century and the 20th century, and they'll be different to the 21st century. And so it's not like Sikhi or maybe Islam failed in abolishing caste. It's that the nature of caste hierarchy transformed over time. And so sometimes this runs a bit in conflict with activists who want to assert 3,000 years of subordination, millennia-long struggle. It is a struggle, undoubtedly. But I think that, say, for instance, the notion of segregation in terms of common dining would be very, very vital to caste practices at the time, or the prohibition on so-called lower caste groups from reading and reciting hymns. That would be at the forefront of struggle in the 15th century. That's why I say the institution of langar is created. That's why everybody's allowed to read the Guru Granth Sahib. In the 19th and 20th century, and so it's not about land ownership. Land ownership in the 15th century is not part of this same sense of hierarchy that we need to abolish it because it doesn't occur in the same way. That is something that I argue takes place and is crystallized and structured into the political economy in the 19th and 20th century. So it is a kind of historicizing of these practices and their difference over time, and that those vernacular sources give a sense of what the issues of the day were and help us track how they change over time. And so Begumpura, and this is part of the other side of the activism, right? That Begumpura is Bhagat Ravi Das's idea about a land free of sorrow and this radical emancipatory vision. And I invoke Begumpura here. And during the farmers' protest, there's a person I actually know who, Randeep, made the claim that Begumpura is here in the Tikri border, and that we've actually achieved this sense of commonality and camaraderie in fighting against a common opponent. And it's a revolutionary, incredible, exciting way of kind of connecting the 15th and 14th centuries to present day struggles and undoing so many sort of built up notions of, again, segregation and hierarchy and a kind of radical, hopeful future. Randeep Madhuke is like one of the people that actually said this. So I think that's the way that there's, on the one hand, historicizing and paying attention to differentiation, but at the same time, in terms of political struggle, there's a collapsing of time and a compressing of it. And I think that's what happens in real struggle too. You can't always insist that the historicization is at the forefront. Actually, people take concepts in all sorts of different ways. To Faraz's point, right, about not leaving too much at the colonial doorstep. Yes, I think I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm also I try to recognize that part of historicizing caste is to recognize its different manifestations in different centuries. It's to go against the argument of wholesale inventions and wholesale, manufacturing at a certain time. There are elements that are drawn upon and reused and disrupted and reordered and produce new sets of relations. So sometimes this runs up against contemporary activists that need a certain narrative for their political project. And I think the work is then to find ways to articulate our differences and yet proceed. So, I think, the danger of right-wing co-optation is present in all that we do, but I don't think that can be a reason to mince what we say or to sidestep certain issues. For instance, if we find things that are difficult, that are uncomfortable, that are contradictory, that don't end up supporting the struggle, shall we exclude them? No, right? We wouldn't do this. We have to have a fidelity to these histories and kind of put them in our work, even if they don't result in a kind of emancipatory outcome, even if they maybe destabilize and trouble movements. I think anybody involved in anti-colonial struggle in the 20th century dealt with this, right? How do you have to deal with the contradictions of a colonized society in your fight against foreign domination. And so rather than subsume them, pretend they don't exist in silence, and rather than let them proliferate and then use that to deny engaging in anything meaningful, I think we find a way to hold the contradiction together and yet proceed with the struggle. And I think it will reveal itself in the prose. Every case is specific, but how one actually writes and discusses these things, I think, is going to be where it'll make more or less sense. I have so much more to say, but I guess I'll find time to talk to you today, because I think that was actually inadequate. But to Ariel's point, quickly, I'll add that one of the things that's very striking about this labor contract is actually exactly as you mentioned, that there is no single task for the peasant to do. And this is part of our own kind of inheritance, right? We think the farmer farms. Is the biologist, the biology student becomes a biologist, the chemistry student becomes a chemist. What does the history student do? Right? This is our dilemma in the humanities in general, right? The English student, what do they do? Tell your dean that, or whatever, your provost. I think that what the contract shows is actually there's all sorts of things. And it's actually unsaid. You're just going to do everything. You're going to cut fodder, you're going to weed, you're going to ensure there's watering. At harvest, you'll be there. And so it's actually a range of things. The only specific thing is looking after cattle. But the rest of it captures the heterogeneity of agricultural production. And I think we've collapsed that in our mind, thinking the farmer just farms, when in fact, this person would have to accompany the cultivator in all sorts of activities. During harvest, there would be more people involved. During planting season, there would be more. Once the crop is fully growing, the activity is much less. And so that unevenness and the shifting nature of agricultural production is something that I think in our modern kind of manufacturing society, we don't think about as much. And so you're right to point that out. And it actually demonstrates that texture and that actually defining who is what and what they're supposed to do is actually a project. It's not obvious, right? It's not timeless. It's actually requires all sorts of work of colonial officials and ascendant Panjabis together.
Are there any final questions? No? All right, well, there should be food, or if it hasn't already arrived, do linger and wait for it to arrive. It shouldn't be long. But let's thank Navyug for this excellent talk.